I love these very silent in between moments when everyone's like, we must be quiet and not, we must not chat while people enter the room.
There's definitely a certain level of awkwardness to it, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
But that's always like when you're in a crowd and you hear the lull and then everyone's like, why is everyone getting quiet? And it gets quiet for no reason. You're trying to figure out if something's supposed to start.
Definitely, yeah.
So I guess maybe we'll wait 20 more seconds and then get started here. We see Carla in the chat. Hi, Carla. Okay, so before we do anything in the session today, it's really important that I acknowledge the original caretakers of this land where I'm situated as a settler. And that's the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Adirondack peoples. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida First Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nations. And I am grateful to be able to work and benefit from being situated on their land. And just keeping this in mind, when we acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices against Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that historical injustice, but also what continues to happen in the present day. And so hopefully in the conversation today, what will reveal itself is an opportunity for further education and an opportunity to think about our own teaching, research, and the way that we engage within our own communities, because that's critically important. So as you know, the topic of today's session is empathy and education as a practice of hope. And so we'll have a chance to touch on each of these things today, but some basic housekeeping before we get into things, and a brief agenda on how we envision loosely the session to go today. We'll first move into introductions from our panelists. And then I have some questions prepared as the moderator today. And we'll also be taking some Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, there is the chat function below, the Q&A function below, where you can input your questions, and we'll integrate that throughout our discussion today, and then move off into whatever tangents make sense for folks today. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Vanessa Sperduti. I go by pronouns she, her, and I recently finally got my doctorate from Western University.
Good job.
Was a moment.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Pandemic PhD. My work focuses broadly on international ed, and more specifically on host communities and understanding their experience with service learning or experiential education. I'm an alumna of MRH 17, and participating in the program really helped me to more critically engage with ideas about oppression and intolerance, and being the kinesthetic, visual person that I am, actually being on the trip itself was very transformative for me. So I will briefly introduce the panelists today, but I will keep it brief because obviously they can speak for themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are. We have Dr. Kari Grain, who's a faculty member at UBC's Adult Learning and Global Change Master's Program, and a special research associate with Simon Fraser University's Community Engaged Research Initiative in Vancouver's downtown East Side. She earned her doctorate in education at UBC and publishes in the area of experiential learning, critical emotion studies, social justice, and the ethics of research involving systemically and historically marginalized communities. Kari is also an alumnus of MRH 2007 and is the author of a forthcoming book, Critical Hope, which I'm so excited to read when it comes out. You can find Kari on Twitter, but I'm sure she'll talk more about that as we go on. Nicole Strandlund is a high school teacher of 14 years in Treaty 4 territory, Regina, Saskatchewan, where she lives with her son, partner, and overly joyful dog. Nicole teaches Canadian history and Holocaust and genocide studies at Greenall High School. She attended MRH in 2010 and actually based her master's thesis on the experience, and that's titled The March of Remembrance and Hope, Critical Pedagogy and Social Justice Activism. And finally, we have Tyra Soosay, an Indigenous third-year law student attending Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Her areas of specialization in law school include advocacy for low-income community members, shown by her pro bono temporary articles at the Indigenous Community Legal Clinic. And she's developed specialized legal research in respect to Indigenous advocacy and Aboriginal law. She's committed to sovereignty and justice for Indigenous peoples, and sits graduating in 2014 with a Bachelor of Arts with a major in Native Studies. She has committed her work to volunteer experiences to developing awareness of issues and solutions such as Indigenous laws, cultures, and rights for Indigenous communities across Canada in a wide variety of industries. So that's the bio that I gave, but hopefully each panelist here can maybe touch on their experiences a little bit more, how they engage with their experience with MRH either in the past or how that's translated into where they're at today. And we would love to just get to know you a little bit. So I guess we could start with, we'll start with Nicole because alphabetically JK, LMN. No, Kari will start first. And just take 5 minutes and share whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And Vanessa, congratulations on your new PhD. That's great. Greetings to everybody from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. I'm here in the False Creek area of Vancouver. Yeah, and I go by she, her pronouns. I almost said she, they. I just wanted to begin by talking a little bit about my MRH experience in 2007. And for me, it was just extremely transformative. I think this is a common thing, a common word that people use is transformative, which indicates some kind of major change happens. But for me, it was quite visceral, and I think what changed is this sense of responsibility for not allowing history to repeat itself. Particularly the relationships that we developed with, you know, in my year, we were there with Judy Cohen and Pinchas Guter. And, you know, I know that some of what we're talking about today is hope. And for me, there is like a responsibility to hopefulness and action because of the stories that they shared and because of the resilience that they showed on that trip. So I all that to say that the experience really was formative in me deciding the path I took through my master's degree program. And then certainly my focus in education was solidified because I saw the power of education, of experiential education happen through MRH. And it's rare for me to even talk about MRH without starting to cry. So there might be some tearful moments throughout this. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. We so often bracket out emotional experiences in education because somehow, you know, the rational has been associated with, the rational mind has been associated with knowledge for some reason in formal education institutions. And I think that the more we can resist that, that narrative, the better. And for me, MRH was a perfect example of resisting the narrative that knowledge happens through books or knowledge happens through the perspectives of experts with PhDs who wrote the books, because really it happens through people who have lived experiences and who have powerful stories to share. So yeah, I think, I don't know where I'm at in my 5 minutes, but I am now, you mentioned all the things that I'm doing career-wise, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But my book on critical hope that I've recently finished writing I have a section sort of dedicated to the MRH experience and what it has meant in my path to understanding hope in a different way, in a critical way. So I'll leave it at that and pass it back to you, Vanessa.
Great, thanks so much, Kari. And I think, you really did touch on this idea of the power of experiential education. And obviously we have those ties between each other. It's interesting because Kari and I met at a conference in Mexico City. And then it wasn't until, a while later that we figured out that we both went on MRH. So,
Yeah.
The world is smaller than we know.
And you get drawn to people. Like, doesn't it show you that you get drawn to, I feel like MRH is a community of people with something common in us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Kari. Next, we'll go to Nicole, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'll just kind of follow that, just what Kari just said there about this kind of common thread. And I think that that's such a really interesting thing, particularly being that, alumni from MRH are spread all over the globe now. And so my name is Nicole. My pronouns are she and her. And I just want to take a little bit of time to just kind of situate myself in terms of like my experiences and the place in which I live, because I think that that's part of this interesting thread. And it's also a large kind of component of who I am. So, and I guess the other thing is I just kind of want to make sure that everyone knows that, I'm striving today to speak from the heart. And I think that that's something that's such a powerful component of MRH that we do, that it is heart work. So I'm speaking today from Treaty 4 territory in what is today called Regina, Saskatchewan. And I grew up about an hour from here, just north of the Qu'Appelle Valley. And it's a beautiful valley. It's not what people always think about Saskatchewan. It's not just flat. There's this beautiful valley that was formed by receding glaciers. And so, in the midst of this prairie, there's these beautiful lakes and the remnants of aspen woodlands. And it has been, and it continues to be, a special gathering place for the Cree, the Nahiwak, the Saulteaux, the Anishinaabe, the Lakota, and the Métis Nation. And my hometown is just north of this valley, and it's just south of 4 First Nations, which are part of the File Hills Tribal Council. And I was really honored throughout my childhood and adolescence, being a teenager, to develop many friendships and learnings within and on these nations. And when I look back on my experiences growing up, I think of this with a lot of humility because of, the grace that was extended to me, and just how impactful that has been on the journey of my life. Just a couple of 100 kilometers away on the south side of the valley is where my ancestors from Sweden and Scotland came to homestead in the late 19th century. So this settler identity is a part of who I am as well. And so I feel really connected to this valley and to this place. And, it's not far from the cityscape where I reside today and where I talk to you. It's where my house is today. There's so much beauty and joy in this land and its many peoples. But growing up here, I was also really shaped by the injustice that I witnessed. And when I think about this place, there's so much beauty and joy, but there's also so much pain. And within an hour of where I grew up, there were 7 residential schools, with the last school closing, located about 5 minutes from my childhood home. So racism, colonialism, and violence are, not just legacies of the past, they're very much so lived realities for Indigenous peoples and the people of the place in which I have been shaped. And so, as I have grown up and become more educated, I've really begun to unravel and unlearn, and I think relearn and strive to continually do this with many of the false narratives that have shaped and formed my identity. And I think part of that is what in essence drew me to applying for MRH. And in 2010, I was teaching high school history and I was starting to work on my master's. And, like many applicants, I was really passionate about history and justice and human rights and equity. And I think I was just struggling to figure out, what could be done, I think, or what was my role? What could I do? What was my part in combating injustice that I was seeing? And so I reached out to the Regina District Jewish Association, and I just emailed them, and I was like, I've heard about the March of the Living, and what is this? And can I go? And what do I do? And Helen Keston was, a member who just so kindly emailed me back and was like, there's this program called the March of Remembrance and Hope, and you should apply. And she sent me all the information, like didn't know me, just so kindly sent me this information from like a random email. And, sure enough, I applied, and attending MRH with Pinchas Guter, Fagi Libman, academics like Dr. Robert Jan Van Pelt, and people like Carla, Ryla, Yakov, and Ellie really quite literally changed my life, as I'm sure it has for many people. And when I look back on MRH and consider, the 10 days that we spent there, there's a multitude of memories and sensations that are really burned in my mind. And so I kind of jotted down some of them, like the smell of old leather takes me back to the shoes in the metal cages at McDonagh that have since burnt down. When I think about the rain on a warm day, it reminds me of standing outside of like the monument at Treblinka, where Pinchas sang the song that he wrote about his twin sister on the Umschlagplatz. Hair reminds me of Auschwitz. Braiding my own hair might think of, I might think of the braid of Pinchas' sister that he talked about so much. Vivid blue sometimes makes me think of the Zyklon B stained walls of the gas chambers in McDonagh. And now as a mother, I think sometimes I might be snuggling my son, and I've thought a lot about, Pinchas' mom and him talking about filling, I'm going to get emotional too, like Kari was saying, but her just, filling the socks with sugar that she had been saving to try and like sustain them after the liquidation of the ghetto, thinking that this, the train ride, this might provide some sustenance. And so, there's those experiences, but at the same time, thinking about the aspect of hope, I sometimes look at my students when I take them on field trips, and I think about, us being silly, playing our guitar on the bus or watching movies, or like, these people who were strangers like a couple days, and then here we are like falling asleep on their shoulders, and, sitting together and debriefing, and the knowing glances, and just being able to establish this community, the knowing of people who have experienced MRH. But I guess ultimately for me, like Kari was talking about a sense of responsibility coming for it. And I think for me, coming from, a relative position of privilege, being able-bodied, white, heterosexual, like this sense of privilege that I had, MRH really shook the false sense of security that I had. And for me, I think it was about coming to more fully recognize and grapple with that there's, if there's not equity for all, then there's not equity at all. And that, our collective survival is really wrapped up in decolonizing, anti-oppressive, anti-racist work. And now as a mom, for me, my son's survival is wrapped up in that as well. And so it's really taken on like a new fervor. And so I just wrote down 2 quotes that for me really stood out as well, that education for liberation must be as much about the mind as it is about the heart. So that's Paulo Freire. I always say his last name wrong. And also Lily Watson, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And so those are 2 things that I think have really stayed with me from MRH. So.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And, as you were describing the geographic space of the Valley, I always think it instantly brought me to this conversation that I always have with my nieces. And when, we sit down and we cuddle and we talk about our days, I always say, what was your peak and what was your valley? So what was your happy moment today and what was something that was challenging? And I think as you talked about some of, the beauty of the land, but also some of the challenges that happen there, I was instantly brought to that emotional space as well. And so thank you so much for sharing that. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Can we move to Tyra, just so she has an opportunity to introduce herself, and then we can get to some questions.
Sure. Hi, I'm Tyra Sousay, and I am Indigenous. I'm Saatu Dene from Northwest Territories, and I'm Anishinaabe from Ontario. I've lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba my whole life, currently a student at the University of British Columbia. And my MRH experience, I took it back home to my research. And I pulled a lot of my experience into my research through meeting the survivors. That was one of the most impactful moments of the MRH 2019 journey that I embarked upon. And being able to witness and hear the truth of their story, that has been very impactful on me when talking to genocide survivors, is that people need to witness the truth of what happened. And it's so impactful, like whenever you go through trauma in life, to be acknowledged, to be heard, to be listened to, that's part of the healing process. And it really makes me think about like decolonization and truth and reconciliation in a different way. So the way that I like to think about decolonization is envisioning a new reality. So decolonization for Indigenous peoples is giving land back and giving life back. And the most important part for me in that decolonization movement is about giving life back. Like, we are constantly having our lives taken away in Canada and around the world. And whether it's through incarceration, whether it's through CFS, taking our children and having them be put in homes that aren't safe or aren't loving homes, just like the residential school system, just like the 60 scoop. So, I mean, genocide hits home for me because I still live it. My family still lives it. My family has lived through it. And going to the other side of the world, across the sea, going to Poland, going to Germany, and witnessing what I can remember is historical archives, museums of history on Christianity, on where Jewish people came from, museums that show the atrocity, like the genocide sites, still having them reclaimed to memorialize and to educate on why we should never ever have genocide again. It really hit home that we don't have that in Canada, and that we don't have this long written articled system of oppression that's still here, because there's still a lot of denial here. But yeah, but it was still really beautiful to be able to be a part of the witnessing of another culture's, another race, another people's struggle, and to kind of look to see for solutions. I hope that the people who go on the next MRH journey, that you're able to look and see the solutions in the journey, like see what people reclaimed, the retribution, what happened to them, what did the governments do to rectify the wrong, what are the people doing, and really maybe bring it back here, bring it back home for Jewish people back here in Canada, for new refugees that are coming to Canada, for Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of people who will benefit from this learning journey, and you can rebuild some hope, critical hope here.
Thank you so much, Tyra. And something that I really liked that you said was envisioning a new reality. And I think part of that, comes with tough conversations and acceptance, particularly on the side of settlers, that um, facing that hard reality and having the conversation is important, but critical in terms of how we move forward as a society, acknowledging those injustices. So thank you so much for sharing. I'll just move on into a couple of questions. So in advance, I know that Kari, Nicole, and Tyra have had the opportunity to connect amongst themselves. And I wonder, just based on your conversations or your reflections, and as many of us are, in conversation today about MRH as a unique opportunity for learning and reflection, thinking about more generally now as a society, we're wrestling with so many sources of inequity and injustice. And so for you, what is the foremost concern in the current age? And then, and then we'll follow up after that. But so what is the foremost concern of you in this current age or time? So whoever wants to start, please feel free.
That is a giant question. And I can see all three of the panelists looking at each other like, you go, no, you go. I don't know. I'll just maybe start us off. I thought about this a lot when I was writing my book, because I wrote so much about issues like racism, for example. But what I talked about was sort of like the fact that climate change, to me, climate change, eclipses is not quite the right word, but climate change is like taking care of our planet and where all of this stuff happens is so much on another level of concern, because as we degrade the environment, as resources become more scarce, as people don't have access to clean water, as people don't have a safe place to live, all of the problems that we think about in society, all of the major issues, whether it's, I'll use again the example of racism or poverty, all of those get exacerbated. So very central and foundational to everything we're working towards in a social justice movement is the very ground that we stand upon. And when I say foundational, I mean it in a very literal sense. Like the earth we are on needs to be cared for us to even be able to fight for these things. So to me, that is far and away the biggest issue. And it doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't talk about all the other things, because everything deserves, there are so many people. And I think a lot of different people come with different sets of expertise and learning and lived experiences that, some are geared towards specific issues, and that's important. But I think climate change is everybody's business, and caring for the earth is everybody's business. So I'll leave it at that and pass it over.
I can just jump on behind what Kari just said. I think that land, and Tyra kind of touched on this too, at how critical the concept of land is really at the crux of everything. It reminds me of like the Thomas King quote that like, what he talks about, like my friend, I don't speak French, but he's like, the raison d'etre is like, it's about land, the reason why people came, but I think I recently watched on TikTok, but Amali Shinga, she's from South Africa, and she does this great video where she like breaks it down. And for her, everything really falls under white supremacy. And so when we talk about like the degradation of Mother Earth, when we talk about the domination and control and power and systems of exploitation and patriarchy and racism and capitalism, ableism, like homophobia, like transphobia, like it just goes on and on and on, this list of all of these, things that are so, I think, deeply concerning. She puts that under the umbrella of white supremacy. And that really, that's at the crux of this. And that her work, that really spoke to me, because I think for me, I would go back to like capitalism would be kind of where I would go. And I'd be like, unfettered capitalism and the exploitation of the earth is what is causing, the other systems of domination, patriarchy, racism and so on would fall under that. But then when she said white supremacy, I was like, that really spoke to me. So for me, I think these are all great issues, and the climate crisis is definitely something that, like, I'd be lying if I said it didn't give me some sleepless nights. But I think it comes back to that issue for me anyways, or thinking about her work, it comes back to white supremacy. And that just really spoke to me. But the issue of land and how that connects.
Nicole, just to jump in here, do you mind saying the name of that? I'm a big fan of TikTok educators because I think it's such a great way to educate the general public. Could you share just the spelling in the chat when you get a sec?
I'll post it in there. And she's on Instagram. So like I found her TikTok videos through Instagram. So that's another option too if you don't have TikTok. So I'll post that in there.
Thank you.
And she also has a link tree as well. So you can support her work financially as well, which I think is important. So that's there too.
I just wanted to jump in to say that I think to combat inequality and injustice, one of the solutions that we can put forth is unconditional kindness. From the MRH journey, we had the very privileged opportunity to meet, I forget the exact wording, but they get heroes medals of honor for taking in Jewish people and people who are being persecuted and hiding them, and in essence saving their lives. And that's an example of unconditional kindness, and kindness towards, as everyone else is saying, the climate crisis, the earth, kindness towards people, kindness towards the land base that people do or do not occupy, and treating each other unconditionally kind. It's very hard, righteous among the nations. Yeah, that was one of the most beautiful moments for me was being able to meet a living person who had saved people and taken them in and hidden them in their times of crisis. And that's an example. And kindness is one of the Indigenous teachings and Indigenous laws that were given to our people. And we were told as human beings, that's the way that we have to live when we're here. But living that in practice is very hard in today's world. I acknowledge that, but I really think that that's a hard but very important place to start.
Something for me, I think, connecting all of your responses, is this idea of one health. And so one health is not just the environment or just animals or just human beings. It's a mutual health that we have to work toward together as all living beings existing. And so that obviously is one of the biggest challenges that we have. And it's almost this level of immediacy that it almost feels too late, but like you have to hold on to that hope to keep pushing for better. And so just kind of piggybacking off of that, we often hear that education is the solution, is always a solution to fixing society's problems, or, we should add a course in the Bachelor of Education program so that way future teachers are better teachers, or they're educating their students, or they may have to learn themselves. So when we think about education, for those who may say it's too idealistic or too hopeful, what would you say? Or maybe you do agree that it is, though I doubt it, but what do you say to those folks that say, well, education can't fix everything?
I'll maybe jump in, like, as a practicing teacher. I teach high school, so I teach mostly grade 12, so students who are like 17 turning 18. And I work with other educators. And I think that society does place a lot on the shoulders of educators. And I don't think that, you know, all the things that we're talking about, like the like ongoing list. Sometimes I think about it as like credits from like a movie. Those are like the injustices that we face in our society. They just keep rolling. And I don't think that like the education system alone is going to solve those. And I think that we also have to really recognize that like the education system is an institution, and like many institutions, like this systemic forms of oppression exist, and that the education system has been used as a tool of genocide and violence in Canada and abroad. And so the history and the contemporary reality of education is in many ways one of colonialism and of genocide. And but that being said, I do believe that there are opportunities to, you know, teach towards like liberation, like our collective liberation. You know, I think that the importance of instilling, like, not instilling, I think that's the wrong word, maybe fostering, because I think our students come to us with so much that we can learn from them as well, but fostering critical consciousness and critical empathy. So not just sympathy, but this empathy that requires action. And this consciousness where, you know, we think about systems of power and systems, you know, of relationship and who are we and how did this come to be and what might be, you know, kind of what Tyra was saying, imagining, providing space to imagine different realities. And so, you know, I think that there is lots of hope in education. And I think that when I think about some of the pedagogical practices that were applied throughout the MRH experience, I think that those practices can be applied throughout classrooms and other learning spaces. But like, as like cheesy as it sounds, sometimes I feel like I'm saying cheesy things, but like that, like I do think education for transformational change or like liberation is hard work. And I really go back to like Sean Wilson's work where he talks about like respect, reciprocity, and relationships. And for me, that's like relationships and building that relationality, I think is so important. I'm rambling on now, but maybe education is part of the antidote, but like, I don't think in the institutional, like industrial capitalist way that like dominant groups have imagined education doesn't have to look like that. And many other people, you know, Indigenous peoples have had different systems of education that aren't necessarily going to, you know, be as oppressive. So rambling.
Tyra, do you want to go ahead or shall I go next? Okay. I really am kind of pulling on something that Tyra emphasized and also something that you emphasized, Nicole, which is this idea of, you know, kindness being at the center of educational work. And, you know, when you're talking about education that is for liberation or transformation, there is a lot of, there has to be anger and rage there too. It's like anger, rage, and grief. I developed a set of principles for a critical hope. And one of them is that anger and grief have a seat at the table, and that we owe it to the necessity of change to be hospitable to the emotions of anger and grief, because they are telling us a truth that we might rather turn away from. And we have to, we owe it to them to listen. And yet that needs to be paired with this undying commitment to kindness and love for one another. And you know, we can call it cheesy, but I think sometimes that language of like kindness or friendship is cheesy. It has been a tool also of oppression, of saying like, let's leave relationships out of this, because we can somehow boil this down to something that is without the heart of that. And that's a tool of oppression because it doesn't allow people to gather and be together for a cause. And so I think there is something very powerful and important about allowing these contradictory things to coexist in an education system. So not necessarily, how can we take something like anger or grief and learn from it and harness what it is offering towards something that is less oppressive? And yeah, similar, I guess, just similar feelings that it's a dance and it's a balance that has to be had. And you can't have one without the other, because all rage or grief is going to leave everybody hopeless and in despair, and therefore not generating change. But all kindness is also going to not allow for the uptake of these unjust histories that people have either witnessed or they are sharing stories about. So they are dance partners in this world that need to make change together, I think, or lovers.
We can move on to more questions if you wanted.
Sure, that sounds great. So thinking about MRH specifically, we know it's, as we've mentioned, a transformational experience. And so how can educators better incorporate experiential learning? So thinking about that learning that does happen outside of a classroom setting, it's evident that it does happen. So how do we incorporate that into our classrooms as practitioners, with the organizations that with whom we may work? How do we incorporate that component?
So for MRH, I would categorize MRH as experiential learning. And for myself as a learner, I found it very impactful. And I don't know if it's because of how I grew up. Like, I grew up in the ceremonies and Indigenous ceremonies, and ceremonies are out on the land. Ceremonies are in relationship to kin and people. And spaces of learning are more free flowing. You're learning from someone, you're developing principles of patience and listening. And a lot of MRH was patience and listening and looking to the elders who have something to teach us. And I found that very beneficial.
Nicole or Kari, did you want to add something?
I'll add, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Tyra said about MRH being really exemplary of the idea of experiential education. I spent a couple years at UBC asking the same question of how can the institution better support experiential forms of learning, and move away a little bit from this idea of lecture-based learning at the university level. Well, I think one of the big, I mean, it's a logistical challenge, but I think one of the big challenges is that good educators, I want to say just straight up, good educators use experience and use experiential forms of learning, and they need to be supported because it's a lot of extra work and it's a lot of extra resources. And so if an institution is saying that they want to have better education for their students or experiential education, then that institution needs to support, like, show them the money, right? Like, you have to back up educators who want to do this stuff. And likewise, you need to, if there are people who are stuck in the same lecture that they've been doing for 15 years over and over, you need to support those folks and sometimes nudge them to spaces of expanding towards more experiential ways of sharing knowledge. So I think that some of the challenge is very much like a resource-based one. And I have a lot more to say on that, but I think that the one more thing I want to add is that anecdotally, there is evidence to suggest that the people who are doing this really experiential, enriching, transformative work are marginalized educators. So whether they are racialized, whether they are women, they are people who are already burdened by a lot of other factors, being asked to sit on, do committee work, or teach a certain group of people about this, things that they're being unrewarded for. And then so to further ask them to put the extra heart work and emotional labor into these types of education, it just needs to somehow be rewarded so that we don't have a bunch of really good educators who are burned out. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that both Tyra and Kari have touched on some really, really important things there. And so I think that when I think about the power of experiential learning, and I think about MRH, I think place-based, I think survivor testimony, I think testimonial reading, and I think like a pedagogy of discomfort, which kind of goes back to what Kari was saying earlier about like being uncomfortable with like some of these emotions and sensations that we're experiencing. So I think in education, we hear a lot about creating safe spaces. And I think that that's important, but at the same time, safe spaces for whom? And if we're not challenging, white supremacy and homophobia and those kinds of things in the classroom, we're creating a safe space for people who already have power and privilege. And so the discomfort, I think, is really important. And I think that we can take those things I'm really hung up on what Tyra said about reimagining things. And that's going to stay with me. And I think it's reimagining what learning, what education might mean. And so when we think about place-based education, the work of having to go somewhere is difficult, but what is around us? How can we interact and just get students out of that classroom setting? How can we bring in survivors, to our building to hear firsthand from people, when we're talking about, where I come from, residential schools, how can I support those people coming into our building, talking about, a number of other things. And I think that, then, technology, how can technology support that? So, this year with COVID, obviously I can't take my students in Holocaust and Genocide Studies to Poland, but doing a virtual tour of Auschwitz and being able to, see the aerial footage and being able to see that, and then having, me talk about my experiences of what I smelled, just trying to fill in those sensational experiences, watching videos of survivors. It's not the same as going there, which is kind of tying into the next thing that we're looking at, like foregoing the travel portion of the trip. But that I think that there are other opportunities and other avenues to kind of, I guess, provide students with some of that experiential learning. And then wherever possible, really creating that here. Taking students out on the land. And a knowledge keeper, Philip Brass, that we're working with at our school, he talked about helping students and staff, and he talked about falling in love with the land again. And that really spoke to me in the sense that, like, how do we fall in love with the land again and learn from the land and learn from place? And I think if we don't get out of the classroom, in the classroom, like the four walls of the classroom, because the classroom is so much more than that, right? But then we'll kind of get stuck in there. So just getting out whenever we can. And like Kari was saying, like all the obstacles to it, I think people in positions of privilege need to break down those obstacles. So like if I'm on a staff and I have some time to support some of my coworkers and like organizing field trips for all of us, or trying to take on some of that labor that maybe has been disproportionately placed on the hands of some people. Teamwork.
It's really interesting hearing the sort of the threads connecting all of the conversations. And something that popped out to me was this idea of the labor that goes into the experience. So obviously seeing the importance and the worth and the critical nature of having those opportunities available, but the precarious nature of it in terms of, you know, not only the logistical work that goes into it, the administrative work, but also the emotional work of the individuals organizing and, you know, making connections or creating those relationships with community partners, as an example, or in the case of MRH, with survivors, or you know, with folks on the ground in those communities. So I see that labor as so much more than just the logistical work, but also, as all three of you had mentioned, that heart work, and really coming from inside. And so I think about, you know, how unfortunate it was that MRH wasn't able to carry out as usual over the last 2 years. And so, Nicole, you had touched on this a little bit, but thinking about the trip, the MRH trip itself, and how you envision it potentially shifting, how do you see technology maybe driving the MRH experience, or more broadly, experiential learning? Because so much of it was that sense of place, those smells, and being there.
I felt like that was directed at me, so let me jump in there. For me, I actually like, I hope that as soon as it is able to, it will return to in like place-based, actually going there, because I think that although there are many things that have been done to kind of support that, the full sensations that one experiences of being in that place, like land has spirit, and to me, that is, being there is just like, I don't think you can replicate that. But you know, I do think that technology has been supportive, like even things like this to me is really meaningful, and being able to continue to build relationships with the MRH community, even beyond like different years, is, I think, really valuable. And there's also, like, you know, there are some really good technological resources that are out there. You know, I briefly mentioned, like, the Holocaust, the Auschwitz Museum has, you know, a virtual tour, and you know, the Azrieli Foundation has created some really powerful, like, you can see Pincus talking about his story and going through these different things there, and it's him talking, sitting, you know, talking there, and in the United States, they've made a hologram of him, and I think that those kinds of technology are certainly helpful, and I do have, you know, concerns about what happens when, you know, people like Faggy and Pincus aren't here anymore. But I think that's part of the reason I feel such a commitment to speak to my experiences, is because I feel like it's something that other people won't have the opportunity to have. And, you know, being able to sit beside, you know, Faggy and Pincus, and, you know, Pincus, his piercing blue eyes, you know, staring at you, is, I don't think it's like replicable. So it, not in the same way. It doesn't mean that it can't be powerful. It doesn't mean that it can't be transformational. But I don't, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to agree with you there, Nicole. I don't think it's replicable. And one of the challenges, certainly for me as an educator over the past year and a half, is I was kind of like the de facto experiential education person at UBC. So I was getting lots of emails from provosts and deans and professors saying, so how do we make experiential education? How do we do it online? And for the longest time, I was like looking for resources about this. How do I answer their questions? And I had a conversation with a couple of people, and it was like, oh yeah, that's kind of the essence of experiential learning sometimes, is that there is something unreplicable about a visceral connection to something. And absolutely, technology can mimic a lot of this. It can assist us It allows us to speak to people from across the country in this case, but it just does not have the same, it just doesn't have the same impact. And I think when somebody suddenly told me like, it's not, you can't do it that way. I was like, oh, so that could be my answer. Like I was searching around for answers, and it was like, my answer might be that it's not doable. And it doesn't mean that we don't have tools, but I put a link, Dimensions and Testimony. Nicole had mentioned that they made a hologram, I don't know, of him in the States, but there are some amazing technologies. And that one in particular it's like interactive biography. So it's almost like you're talking with him. So these are amazing things that we can use. But I think the point in all of this is that those of us who have had the honor of going on MRH and sitting beside them, and you talk about his piercing blue eyes, and sitting in the very place where the story, you're being told a story about this room full of bunk beds by the person who lived it. I still get like, I just felt like the hair on the back of my neck go up when I remembered that at Auschwitz, of Judy telling us a story. And it's our responsibility. Like we're the torchbearers, so to speak. We have been passed these stories, and it doesn't mean they're ours to tell, but it does mean that they are, that I guess we can be conduits of it. I do believe that in the case of the survivors that I went on MRH with, we've been given permission and been asked by Judy and Pinkos to, share forward their insights, share forward their stories. And that's not always the case. Sometimes people don't want you to tell a story that is rightfully theirs, but I think in this case it is.
Tyra, I'll give you an opportunity to answer if you'd like.
Sure. I suppose like in the past year that COVID's happened, I've become a mom, and my focus has been on building a healthy, happy home for my daughter. And the kind of world that she's going to live in, the kind of hardships that she's going to face, like things have impacted me more deeply since becoming a mom. And I know one of my goals for her in her lifetime would be to bring her to these sites that I've gone to with my family, and to ensure that she is able to learn another person's history and to understand the sort of learning that we went through on MRH. But she has her own journey here in Canada through genocide as well. And part of me rebuilding a better world and a better identity for her is for her to know who she is, her own identity, and her culture. So I've committed myself to providing her experiential learning opportunities in ceremony, in culture, and as marginalized people too. Sometimes it's hard to do these experiential learnings. It's hard to put up the money, the gas, the camping, the tents, to make sure that these learning opportunities are there for our children. But that's something that I am very committed to. And, before MRH, I hadn't really thought, like on the journey of being there, I hadn't thought about how Carla had the pain that she must have gone through, to see how her parents were treated, to see how, that grief that sticks to you, that trauma residue, but to be giving back so much to us in taking us to these sites, being there for us in the pain that we were processing. Like the people who are a part of MRH make the journey so beautiful. And I'm really glad that they got some time to sit back, even though COVID was horrible. I'm really glad that they got some time to sit back, to take a breath, and to evaluate how things were going. And I hope that you were able to do a little bit of healing work and be ready to start back up when we do go again, right? Because yeah, it is a lot of work to do these types of things. Like no matter the type of experiential learning that you're doing, it's a lot of work for a lot of people. And I appreciate it so much more now.
And I'd like to just kind of feed off of all of your comments and thinking about sort of these future generations and how we sort of envision moving forward. And so in each of your own spaces, how do you observe the next generation wrestling with ideas about oppression, genocide, and justice? You know, as all three of you sort of touched on, we are so sadly losing Holocaust survivors. And so how do you imagine your responsibility as a witness moving forward? And what does that look like in your own life, in your own vocations, and your own space?
I guess just like as I was talking about my daughter, exposure, like leaving MRH, Jewish culture, Jewish heritage. I didn't know anything about Europe's history. And I think what I left with was seeing that I needed to be a part of another community. I need to insert myself actively and search for ways that I can help or that I can be kin. And that's something that I would want to grow for my daughter in any community that we're living in, is to become kin to other people and grow our exposure of different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of celebrating. Yeah.
Vanessa, can you ask the question one more time? Sorry, I'm having trouble.
It was a big one, so no worries. So the question is, in your space, how do you observe the next generation wrestling with ideas about oppression, genocide, and justice, and thinking about what that might look like in your own life and vocation moving forward?
Yeah, okay. So for me, I have to say that working with young people, Nicole mentioned she works with 17 and 18-year-olds. I work with pretty much like 19 to 22-year-olds, and then sometimes like master's level students as well. And I think it's similar, like when I just like flash to recent memories I have of working with young people, I am so hopeful for the future because they know just worlds more about like oppressive Canadian history, for one thing. Like I was never taught even one thing about residential schools when I went through, like I went to school in Kelowna, and I've often reflected on the fact that I never even, like Kelowna is on unceded Indigenous territories, and I never even learned the name of the Syilx Nation until I had left and returned to the Okanagan for a speaking engagement. So these are the sorts of things that I think children growing up, my observation is that they are, learning to do land acknowledgements, and climate change is on the top of most young people's radar. Like a lot of people are being activists, and things like knowing, talking about gender and sexuality on a continuum rather than as a binary. Like certainly, and I can say more in the Canadian landscape, I can't speak to the American landscape because there have been some shifts happening there, but I just feel so hopeful. I feel like we are in such good hands, and in many ways, sometimes folks that are holding on to power are actually just doing a disservice to the younger generation who are here and ready to make changes. They're ready to move forward with new policies and reimagining something better, you know, as Tyra was saying. So I'll pass it over to whoever else would like to go.
Yeah, I feel the same way, like working with high school students, that you know, what Kari is just saying about I think young people are ready for the change that is occurring. I think there is a reawakening of something in people, where, you know, people are realizing that the path we are on is not one that can continue, and that a shift is collectively needed. And, you know, I see young people really, I think, not all of them, but a large majority of them grappling with the realities of the world in which we live, and the systems from which many of them benefit. And, you know, what does it mean for them, and how might they take action? And I think also, like, I think a lot of humility, in the sense that like I think about that with hope. I was even thinking about that, like who am I to, like, you know, not have hope, and to not do whatever I can to carry the action, you know, action forwards. You know, I think about people like I don't know, like James Baldwin and bell hooks, and like people like, these movements have been happening for, you know, Indigenous people. These movements have been happening. People have been saying these things for, you know, thousands of years. And just having people kind of people with power and privilege starting to maybe listen a little bit more. And when I think about like young people, like I think about, like, there's a group of young women in my neighborhood that started the community fridge. And it's all about like mutual aid, and they use social media. That's how they organize the whole thing. And it's just become this beautiful thing in my neighborhood, that everybody is really like engaged. Like I take things from my garden that I grow and, you know, take it to the community fridge. And it's about like this love that we have for our community. And it was, you know, these young women who are like 19 and 20 who just were like, you know, here's a need that we have, and here's how we can, from a grassroots collective, organize this. We don't need, you know, our provincial government or our federal government to step in. We can do this. And yeah, it's just, I think about like those relationships. So I do see so much hope in young people. And I think about my son too, like Tyra, like I'm a mom as well. And I felt this shift when I had my son, and things became, I think it was in some ways like kind of a spiritual thing, where I went from being so kind of ingrained in this final thought process to thinking more with my heart. And that was really an interesting thing. And so, you know, the way in which he will be raised will not be the way, you know, that the world in which I was raised. And, you know, I think about just like, even the things I want him to be able to witness, like we see more language revitalization in our community. You know, people, somebody came around from a political party last night, and their business card was in Cree, English, and French. And I thought, you know, that's a small thing, but that's great to see. And my son, that's much more normalized for him now. You know, he knows that we live in Treaty 4 territory. He already is like, you know, we have a sign outside our house about, you know, like Orange Shirt Day, and he sees orange shirts hanging in our community. And this is, you know, we're having these conversations, and he's 5. So kind of what you were saying too, Kari, like this intentional, like, you know, when we think about like the like like the kind of problems with education, the like obstacles in it, like those are intentionally there, right? And now I think we're seeing like the intentional challenging of some of those things, and the intentional, I guess, maybe removal of some of them. So
thanks so much. And I do really, what resonated with me was this idea of creating this happy, healthy, like Tyra said for her daughter, happy, healthy, and almost like a human world, you know, like where we acknowledge one another and where we take care of one another. And so I'm just cognizant of time, and I know we have maybe about 5 minutes left. And I did have a question that Nicole sort of started answering. I love how you do that. But my final question to you is, what is bringing you hope right now, both as a teacher or a student, a mom, human being? What is like one thing that's giving you hope?
I'll just jump in. The silence is too awkward for me.
Teacher trip. If
Yeah,
you wait long
exactly.
enough, someone will answer.
Usually not the person you want. No, I'm just kidding. I think hope for me is it's like a really interesting thing, which is, Kari, I'm very interested to read your book. So you got to give us all the details on it, because, I think for me, I guess I see, like, I think about like, you talk about radical hope, and I think the idea of like radical love. Tyra's talking about kindness, and, kind of connecting those things, and where do I see those things, and where do I guess, sense those things. And I think that provides me with a lot of hope. But at the same thing, I go back and, I think about like hope is action too, right? And it's about, taking that action. And I think about like, I guess, like, I don't know. I guess I'm so inspired by people like Pincus and Faggy and Carla, and just thinking about like I guess that I just feel such a responsibility to kind of that action, and that it's one thing to have, the empathy and the caring, but then moving that into action. So, I think about like hope for me as like planting a garden. It's like reading books and then distributing them in our community libraries. It's working with my colleagues to like, have a book club, and then to work with our knowledge keeper, and then to create bulletin boards and like stupid TikTok and Instagram videos for our students. And like, because we're trying to like meet them kind of where they're at, it's about really listening. I think like I feel like I have so much like learning left to do. So I want to really like listen, and I guess come to it with humility. But at the same time, I think it's about like, really when it comes down to it as well, like, being willing to, kind of put your body on the line, and like opting out isn't really an option. We're engaged in a collective struggle for our survival. I really do feel like that. And so we are so closely intertwined, and we were talking about that with MRH and how intertwined we are, and there's hope and there's beauty and there's joy and love in that. COVID, like Tyra said, COVID has been awful. But at the same time, it has really reminded me of how intertwined we are as a society, and how our decisions, are so collectively linked. So I guess there's hope in the collective for me.
Tyra, did you want to go?
Sure. I have hope through new generations. There's intergenerational changes. They might be minor, they might be big. But for example, on MRH, Ellie was standing in the streets in the middle of Germany and Poland with us, in streets where he would have been persecuted within his lifetime. My daughter is living with us, and her grandparents are raising her alongside her parents. And that's an intergenerational change for my family. Stolen children, stolen lives, things change in generations. And it's just very hopeful to see those minute changes. And I take on the responsibility of stopping abuses in their tracks. I will be the change maker. And that gives me hope for the next generation.
That was so beautifully said. I think that one of the themes that has been coming up today is like age groups of people, like babies and children, and how they give us hope through their insistence on a future and their insistence on existing into the future that we won't be a part of. And then I think of us being like somewhere that middle generation of people who are right now really active in society and being, you know, taking up the labor and the work to make this better. But then I also think of our elders like Pinkas, and I think of my grandmother. I call her Besta, and she's, you know, she was born in like the northern tip of Norway into very like really hardship conditions and not enough food. And she's in Canada now, and she's 101 years old. And, you know, sometimes we think about the older generation as like conservative or not willing to make changes, but there are so many elders who have shown us the way of like, we have to make changes. I've seen a whole lifetime of how this doesn't work. And, you know, I see small ways that my grandmother, even though her mind kind of comes and goes, how she wants to like, oh, preserve water. You know, she doesn't want to waste water. And, or, you know, just small changes she can make, like small donations she can give to somebody who is in need. These are still inclinations of hers, which are very human and oriented in kindness. And I think I'm really touched by the way like multiple generations of people have a role to play in thinking forward and thinking about hopefulness. So that's where I get my hope, is from every group of people in a different sort of a way.
And I feel hopeful after this conversation today, because I often find myself bogged down. And I think, Kari, in the past, you and I have talked about this, and you talk about this hope sort of being an anchor. And sometimes we have to sort of let ourselves go from that and return to it. And so conversations like this always seem to ground me as an individual. And I feel like there is a way forward. And I just like to thank all three of you for sharing today, and for you know, connecting your own personal life, your experiences with MRH, and being so open with everyone in conversation. So thank you. And I'm just making sure there's no more questions, but we're good.
Thank you for hosting, Vanessa. You've asked some amazing questions, and I really appreciate how you guided us through the process.
And thanks to Jason Ho for organizing everything. I know he's in the background here, and he's always working so diligently. And I love how he ends his emails. He puts, you know, here to serve, but he genuinely means it. So thanks, Jason, for all of your work.
Yeah, and I just want to say thanks to everybody as well. I feel like I have gained so much from this conversation. I like have a page full of notes and just like things that I just want to think about more. So thank you for, you know, Tyra and Kari and Vanessa and Jason for, you know, organizing and sharing. The experience. It's been 11 years for me since MRH, and I feel like I keep, there are so many gifts that I continue to get from the experience. So thank you.
Thank you. And Nicole and Tyra, I'd love to stay in touch with you. If I think I have your email in that thread, but it'd be great to connect again sometime.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. We'll see
Thank
you soon.
you.
Carla,
Bye.
good to see your name in there.